Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping the world, inspiring the future creators, and all those for like really great stories. I'm Ira Pastor, here as your health, aging, and longevity ambassador along for this ride. So here we are in the year 2019. We, as most people know, have surpassed around the world about $7 trillion in annual healthcare expenditures, about $1 trillion of that goes to pharmaceutical products every year. And as we've been watching the traditional sort of pharma basket change over the last century from your small molecule drugs to your larger macromolecule biologics, proteins, antibodies, and now into sort of this era of gene and cell therapies, the tools that allow these discoveries and development to happen have been changing as well. And a set of tools that we've been hearing quite a bit about in recent years and discussed a bit on the show is the triad of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning, and sort of the respective applications in the drug discovery and development process. And we've heard a lot about a term mentioned alongside this called in silico. Basically referring an expression that means either performed on a computer or via a computer simulation in reference to different biological experiments. And we've talked a bit about these applications on past shows in terms of using some of these tools, for instance, to better guide the rational drug design process, or more appropriately select patients for a clinical trial, a la personalized medicine. But we've really not yet addressed the so-called 800-pound gorilla in the room. And that is, in drug development, even after you have that perfect drug candidate and you have your perfect inclusion-exclusion criteria, traditional clinical trials still cost billions of dollars, take years and years of hard work, with ultimately no guarantee that your drug will make it through the complexity that is represented in the human body, with its 30 trillion cells, its endless array of heterogeneity, microenvironments, gene expression, and so forth. But what if that wasn't the case in the future? What if it was possible to conduct an in silico clinical trial on a virtual body that could basically mimic human physiology? Well, we're going to talk about that topic today because we're joined by Dr. William Pruett from the Physiology and Biophysics Department of the University of Mississippi Medical Center. With a doctorate in mathematics from Baylor University, Dr. Pruett has been merging his skills from both mathematics, including expertise in representation theory, geometry, combinatorics, numerical analysis, and algorithms, with a really in-depth understanding of the cardiovascular, renal, endocrine, and other physiologies of the human body. Dr. Pruett's research interests include the use of physiological modeling to generate hypotheses and to understand the integrative physiological mechanisms that are not observable in either whole animal or human experiments. His lab, for the past 50 years, the department he's been working in, has been developing these computer simulations of integrative physiology for both research and educational purposes. The current core model, which is called HUMOD, is comprised of 14 different organ systems, including neural, endocrine, circulatory, and renal physiology. And HUMOD provides this top-down model of human physiology from whole organs to individual molecules, and it features more than 1,500 different equations and 6,500 variables, such as body fluids, circulation, electrolytes, hormones, metabolism, even skin temperature, really aiming to mimic and simulate how physiology works, and is currently the most sophisticated mathematical model of human physiology ever created. All that being said, Dr. Pruett, really thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We typically start off the show by just giving our guests the floor so they can talk a little bit about themselves, sort of your background, where you grew up, how you developed an interest in mathematics, how you developed an interest in human physiology, and ultimately here in 2019, sort of how you find yourself at the epicenter of really, not just the epicenter of those two domains, but really this cutting edge component of drug discovery and development.
So math, once I found calculus, math was always just really what I wanted to do. It's a beautiful thing. It is logic just in a perfect world. So I knew I was going to do math, and that was wonderful. I went to school and I got my PhD. And before I went, there was a medical school professor, Dr. Julius Cruz, who just passed away this year, that I waited on a couple times a week. And he was constantly trying to get me to go work in physiology instead. He said, to take this math, go do physiology, do some modeling. It'll be much more useful than anything you'll ever do in math. So I got my PhD in math, in pure mathematics, and there were 3 other people in the world that worked in my field. And as soon as I graduated, I realized, wow, this is kind of going to be a waste. And so I called Dr. Cruz, and he put me in touch with Robert Hester, and he and I have been working together for the past 9 years on this project. So it really got me to a good place. Because at the end of the day, it's nice to take what you do and actually do something useful with it, and try to do something positive as opposed to just trying to do something that's beautiful. And the work that we do really is pretty also. It just took a little while to realize that. So where do I come from? I come from Mississippi, which is a state that has a lot of problems, healthcare and otherwise. We have a widely separated population, huge rural population that has, in general, fairly poor education systems and poor amenities once you get outside of the biggest cities. And so it's hard to get physicians to want to go raise their families in these kinds of places. And so we have big disparities in healthcare that spread throughout the state. And one of our big goals with pushing forwards what we call the future of medicine is to be able to deploy our healthcare resources even in rural areas where we don't necessarily have the physician support that we'd like to, in a more even-handed, efficient, and economical way. And mathematical modeling pairs, we think, really well with these new modalities of care that include the wearables and telehealth and that sort of thing. So for the last few years, we've really been trying to integrate what we've been doing in terms of understanding physiology into something that will also work with this general setting of clinical medicine through the telehealth modality. Now, through that got us to the point of doing in silico clinical trials and clinical trials in general, just trying to make the entire process more efficient, because at the end of the day, if you make the process more efficient, then everybody gets to have a little bit more of a piece, because hopefully it costs a little less. So that's kind of driven our research for the past really 5 or 6 years.
Going from there, then, could you do one of two things now? Two things. One, could you just take us for a walk through HUMOD, what it's about, sort of what it looks like in general, when we talk about the concept of the virtual patient or the virtual subject? I mean, this is something that's very hard to visualize. And at the same time, I just mentioned on previous shows, we talked a little bit about sort of the very early uses of AI in sort of, the rational drug design, and, but once again, it's one thing sort of matching up a compound with a ligand, but once again, getting into physiology and trillions of cells and gene expression and so forth.
Right.
What is, just give us some idea of sort of, what are the tools required for something like this? Are we talking, supercomputers, cloud? What is required for you to actually create a virtual
Gotcha.
human?
So every modeler has a different definition of what makes a model and a different scope and scale that they think of. We think of models that can be run on desktop computers or run on single cores of servers, by and large, because of the scale that we look at, which is whole body scale and tissue scale. We're not doing CFD, we're not doing finite element, we're not doing some of the geometric things that really require huge resources. So to begin off with, just know that we're talking about things that will run in 10 to 100 times real time on your desktop, or even faster. So where did HUMOD come from? Back in the late 50s and early 60s, there was a big debate concerning cardiovascular health as to what was setting the blood pressure chronically. So There were a large number of people in the States that believed it was the heart that determined that. An older hypothesis had been that it was the kidney.
Mm-hmm.
So Arthur Guyton was the chairman of our department, the new chairman of our department at that point in time. This is in really 1962, 63, when he took up this question. And he decided that with his background in engineering, he could put together a computer program. Keep in mind, in the early 60s, you've got your computational resources are a little limited.
Sure.
He decided he could put together a computer program that would take into account all of the systems that we understood reasonably well and how they impinged on blood pressure control and homeostasis, which is the act of keeping a dynamic system at close to steady state or in a limit cycle. And he put together what was at that point in time a very large model comprising 400 or so variables that consisted of the heart, most of the major pieces of the vasculature, the kidney, a little bit of metabolism, angiotensin, aldosterone, renin, and a handful of other hormones and neural components that we had experiments that said, if you do X, then Y will occur. Mm-hmm. So if you take these pieces, these kind of atomic pieces of experiments, and link them all together into the set of feedback loops that approximates a living being, then lo and behold, he discovered that no matter how you parameterized or set the heart, the blood pressure would come to the same level. If, on the other hand, you altered how the kidney was working, mm-hmm. then you saw a difference in blood pressure. And then he used that information he got from the model to take animals, rats, that he gave hypertension in various ways. There are mm-hmm. lots of different ways of doing that. He took the kidneys from the hypertensive animals, transplanted them into normotensive animals, and lo and behold, they became hypertensive. Meanwhile, the kidneys he pulled out of the normal animals, when he put them in the hypertensive animals, they became normal. Mm-hmm. So he proved that the kidney was the seat of high blood pressure. For the next 20 years, this model was developed in fits and starts as we discovered new hormones. For instance, atrial natriuretic peptide was discovered mm-hmm. in 82, I think, and they had to incorporate that into what was known. They used it as an aggregator for new hypotheses of overall blood pressure control in the body. And that was always the goal, was to understand how blood volume was regulated, sure. local tissue blood flow is regulated, and how the cardiovascular system, the neurons, and the hormones all integrated together to give you one picture of how all of that worked. Now, at the end of the day, what we have to understand here is we're looking at a dynamical system, or nonlinear dynamical system even. Okay. All of the control equations here are essentially saturating equations. You have a system that is composed of nested feedback loops, right? You have lots of different things that help you control your blood volume. Right. Help you control your thirst, that help you control how much you urinate, et cetera, et cetera. All of those pieces have to link together. There's redundancies. There's all of these things that make the system too complex for a person to keep in working memory. All of the factors they would need to quantifiably or even qualitatively analyze the system and come up with an idea about what is going to happen in a specific patient or a specific case. So the model was used as an aggregator of information to create this dynamical system. Now, what I noticed when I got to UMC back in 2010 was that in addition to being a dynamical system, it was also an immensely robust system. If you change the parameters in the system by a small amount or even a large amount, in many cases, the system, it changed. You came up with different levels of blood pressure and different heart rates and everything changed, but you wound up going back to stability or to limit cycles, depending on how you were working with the model. So if you've done any work in dynamical systems before, typically as you tweak parameters, you see massively different behavior occur. You see different numbers of attractors established. You see different patterns of basins of attractors. And this is just moving a single parameter one piece at a time. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, this was amazing to us. On the other hand, it was completely and utterly predictable because the fact is each one of us has a body that is defined by the same relationships. You have angiotensin just like I do. Mm-hmm. It acts in the same way in you as it does in me, but slightly differently. And your vasculature is a little different than mine. Your aorta is a little wider or a little longer or a little tougher or a little less tough. All of these minor changes, they don't lead you to be less stable than I am. Right? You're approximately my age. You've lived with your body and all of its parametric differences as long as I've lived with my body and its parametric differences. We're all fairly robust, and in fact, that's what evolution would have us believe. So we set out to create methods that would allow us to take this base behavior, this model that we're thinking of as a set of relationships, that then takes a collection of parameters, a collection of inputs, of elasticities and lengths and sizes and masses, etc., and turns that into an instantiation of an individual person that may or may not reflect an actual living person, but it at least affects a model of the possible, a potential person that could exist, whether they're stable or not. And then we can use that to see how all of these pieces go together. When you study physiology and when you study drug design, one of these problems that crops up is because of the redundancy in the human body, that just because you have an endpoint, that in a controlled experiment where nothing else changes and you move this one piece, the endpoint does what you'd like it to, doesn't mean you don't have 20 or 30 different other systems that are also impinging on that endpoint that are going to cause you to not see the output or the response that you'd like to see. And this is part of what's perhaps guided the failure of trials once you get them past the dosing and equivalence stages, and you look for efficacy in a large population. Sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. So we've looked at this as an opportunity to see how the systems themselves will integrate to give us a better idea about what's happening in the human body across not just one archetypal person that we call human, but rather a population of people.
In addition to, you talk about the sort of the renal physiology, the pathophysiology of hypertension. What other types of things are you looking at currently? I know you have various partners that you're collaborating with. What other types of systems are they working on? And obviously non-confidential stuff, but love to sort of hear the diversity of these different basins.
There are a handful of folks that have been interested in this. One of the greater control aspects of human body is thermoregulation, and it integrates neural patterns, it integrates volume homeostasis. There's a lot of things you do with hemodynamics to help you conserve heat in cold situations or to get rid of heat in hot situations. And so the Department of Defense has a big facility at Natick in Massachusetts that's been investigating that. So we've been talking in with them for years and doing little things for them. There are a number of companies that have done work for DoD looking at, for instance, if you're going to do a mannequin, or if you're going to do a simulation of a soldier that has lost blood, say due to being shot or something, and so they're using it for training, we can interface with mannequins at this point in time so that the mannequin will reflect the physiology that we see in the model, and then whatever happens to the mannequin will influence the model itself. And so you have this loop going back and forth. Instead of, currently, if you do a simulation, if you're doing a training in a simulation center at a hospital right now, you have an operator who tells the mannequin what to do. The operator says, "Hey, look, students, the pulse is stopped," and he hits a button and the pulse stops. And so they know they have to do CPR. And, oh, look, he's doing, the mannequin is doing this. So you have an operator, and if you have two different operators with different understandings of physiology, you can get different perspectives on what the training is. And, it makes training not be homogeneous, which is a bad thing from the perspective. The point of training is to see lifelike situations and to deal with them reasonably, right? So if you get different activities from different operators, then that kind of pokes a hole in the concept as a whole. So using a model to back this up is one of the places that we've had gotten some traction in getting this out. We've gone to the FDA multiple times to talk mostly about the idea of populations and how to tighten up clinical trials. How do you come up with exclusion criterion that are better than well, we want somebody who has adequate kidney function and who has blood pressure within these bounds.
Mhm.
Or rather look for more complex suites of biomarkers that would let the sicker people that are really going to benefit from a treatment be part of the trial as well, and still have an expectation for how they would benefit. So there you're looking at adaptive trials where instead of having a single endpoint you're looking at in a population,
Mhm.
you have an expectation based off of a patient's state, and then you see how far your patients differ from the state that you predicted that they would be in, as opposed to just looking at an overall, for instance, blood pressure drop in response to some new drug or some new intervention, which is an entirely different way of conducting a clinical trial. And again,
Sure.
it lets you reach people that that wouldn't be brought into a regular clinical trial, but that reflect the actual population that the drug will be deployed in when it gets released in the world. Which is useful from our perspective.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Take us, if you would, a little into the future now. And I don't know, sort of, obviously, my mind is spinning here on sort of all the potential things that you could do in the decades to come with this. One that you talked about, you mentioned, and I'm obviously going to be speaking out of my my domain here because I'm not a doctor. I don't have a doctorate in mathematics, but you use the term basin of attractor. And we did a show a few months ago with Lee Hood at ISB out in Seattle, and talking about this concept of an attractor, how these differences in gene expression in you versus me allows that attractor to change in certain directions in Dr. Pruett versus Ira Pastor and so forth. Talk about sort of personalized. Are there going to be hue mods for a Dr. Pruett, a hue mod for Ira Pastor in the future? Where do you see sort of the point? Is it 2050, 2060, wherever, maybe earlier, that the virtual clinical trial will be this? We're not going to be doing clinical trials anymore. Take us, on that little bit of a journey. Obviously, you've brainstormed about this, no doubt.
Well, first of all, you've already had virtual clinical trials.
Okay.
There have been a number of medicines that have made it through phase 3 FDA trials with no patients used in the phase 3 trial. Every patient was a virtual patient.
All right.
All of the ones that I know of, and there may be some that are outside of my domain, all of them have been mixtures of understood drugs, or drugs that were so similar to well understood drugs that mathematical models were able to accommodate all of the FDA's questions, and they did make it through their phase 4 post-marketing work as well. So you already have some trials that are completely being done in silico right now, and this was actually information from 2013, right? So it's been going on for a little while, not very many. The prospect of running trials in silico, at least in the States, came from the FDA Modernization Act of 1996, where you were allowed to use they didn't spell out exactly, but a larger than typical, I can't remember what the exact wording was, pool of data sources in order to influence a decision for the FDA. And that was taken by the FDA to mean that they could use information from in silico trials. And that got tightened up in a couple of later, the reauthorization of the FDA back in 2016. And there was another bill, I can't remember, that also allowed a little additional in silico work. So all of this has been supported by legislation as well as by internal guidance. So the FDA is pretty well on board with using in silico methods, at least to support clinical trials, and in some cases completely replace them. So we'll begin off with that. As to your question about whether we're going to have what I'd call digital twins. So there's this big concept you see in engineering, digital twins. I don't know if somebody has talked about this on your show before, but it's brutally neat, powerful concept, and it's also kind of simple. The idea is that you have an asset, which is a real thing, and you have a model of that asset. And just like the example I told you earlier, where we had a mannequin and a model interacting with the mannequin, here you have the asset, which is wired with sensors, and you have a model of that asset, which is taking the sensor readings and is subjecting the model to the same forces or environment that the asset is being exposed to, and it then produces a prediction about how the asset will perform in future tests or future trials. And as those trials go on, you have comparisons of the asset's performance to the model's predictions of that performance, and the model updates constants that guide that model, structural constants, elasticities, brittleness, things like that, to determine what the future state of the model will be. And so you have this back and forth from the asset to the model and back to the asset again. Okay. So we already have these things on every airplane that flies, right? GE owns all of the engines on the airplanes that have GE engines, right? They don't sell a service contract anymore. You rent the engine by the hour. And they have all these sensors all over the engine, and they have models of all of these components. Not a model of the engine, but a model of the components, a model of the rotor, a model of a little jet, a model of a combustion chamber, et cetera, et cetera. And they keep track of all of these things. And once a component moves the model moves out of its good area, they pull that engine, take it apart, replace the component, and put it back on. So this lets them plan what their upkeep is going to be. It basically it's a nice piece for supply chain. It saved them a lot of money over the past years. They're doing the same thing with windmills. They've done the same thing with railroads. So what your question, or what I hear in your question, is, are we going to have digital twins of people, and when will that happen? So in the wearables world, where we all have wearables at this point in time, you've got your Fitbit or your Polar. I worked with a company for a little while that I wore an EKG, an accelerometer, and a pulse wave detector, and a handful of things, and it could tell when I ate a salty meal. Once it got trained, if I ate a couple bags of chips, it would start throwing little red lights at me. It was designed to take patients that had congestive heart failure and were leaving a hospital, so that you knew what their state was, and you could have a nurse give them a call. Hey, are you out of your medicine? Hey, you've been doing okay with your diet? To try to prevent readmissions for things that can be dealt with a $4 medication from Walmart. Okay. Because we all know hospitalization is expensive, right?
Sure.
The wearables, this concept of monitoring somebody's health status and linking that back to a model that enables you to read from that information something that's a little deeper than just, hey, they're moving, but rather how they're moving, and then what their oxygen utility ought to be when they're moving, and comparing that to their saturation, and comparing that to their respiratory rate, and comparing that to their heart rate, and coming up with a pattern that you expect a person to be in, and tell when they deviate from that pattern, so that you can say, hey, is something going on? Or is this just a new activity that we've not seen before? Projecting these cones of possibility forward for a patient to see what could be going on, and then try to use new information as it updates to put you farther along that cone to decide what's actually going on. These are not that distant in the future. I mean, I think we're looking at 10 to 12 years. Okay. You've got these hybrid closed loop insulin pumps that have been put out by a couple of companies. I know Medtronic's got one. I think Boston Scientific does. I think there's another company too. So these guys will read your glucose level, and have a model on board that runs that glucose level through what they think you're doing, and what your how much insulin has been injected in you, and what kind it was, and what they think your insulin level is right now. And they'll use that to determine how much more insulin you need. Okay, so it takes out this whole, here I'm going to jab myself with a needle every couple of hours thing. You still have to do it yourself for meals, but basically once you get past a meal, it takes care of your glucose monitoring for you, right? So there you do have a digital twin. You have an idealized model of a person, in this case that was tweaked by their physician, and you have it influencing the system, the asset being the person, and then you have the person's data influencing the model, and so you have this new feedback loop. It's just a brand new control loop. So you're seeing that develop even as we speak. I don't know that you will see a model of an entire person, because for that you'd need to have some kind of clinical utility for that. In terms of the hybrid closed loop insulin system, well, there you have a clear system that can be influenced with very clear endpoints. And so we know how to put it through regulation. We know what we need to prove. We know what the benefit is, and we can do that. We can tell insurers, how we want to have the compensation scheme on that build, right? All of that makes sense. The economy is there. In terms of a whole model of a person, like I say, I'm not sure where the economics are on that. And once that question is answered, you'll see them 5 years later. I mean, that's, once there's a financial reason to do it, somebody will close the loop and finish it off. We've got the models at this point in time that can go pretty darn far. It's just a matter of putting together the pieces to have the asset communicate with the model and go back again and then push it through regulation. And that's expensive.
Yeah, that's the case. But I mean, the potential here is pretty staggering. And it's
it is. If you look at, here, I know you do a lot of things with drug design and clinical trials. So just consider this for an example. When you're running a clinical trial, you have, at least at some stages, you have to make sure that your patients are being compliant.
Sure.
Right? Not just with taking their drugs, but with doing the other things they should do also, right? If you've got a new sartan coming out, so an angiotensin receptor blocker coming out, then if your patients aren't staying on their low salt diet, then that can bother your results. That can disturb your results greatly. And knowing what the success in patients staying on low salt diets is, the likelihood is that a fair percentage of your patients are not staying on their diets when they're taking these drugs. They may for a day or two before they come in to get their next blood pressure reading, but they're not going to be doing it for the 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks beforehand. And again, this is just looking at our patient population. If you have a model equipped on top of a wearable that can determine when somebody is taking in too much salt and when their pattern is changing, then that may inform you for excluding certain data points from your reporting to the FDA and give them the information as to why you're performing the exclusion and why that data is bad, which is, depending on how you set up your trial, that's an altogether reasonable thing to do.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't necessarily discount a person, it just discounts one of their measurements, right? So you can see, not to mention, you can use that information to tell the FDA, hey, this is what my drug's going to do when people are not in their optimal configuration, which is a value in and of itself.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, if we think about a clinical trial, this is the joke we always say, a clinical trial is just another experiment, right? You're taking a sample of a population and you're tweaking that, you're biasing that population to have the disease that you want and to have it in the conformation that you think will be the best conformation to show the effect of your drug or your device, and you're hoping that they do everything they're supposed to do correctly. Well, when they don't, how good is your experiment? And when you take it out and put it into the real world and have physicians actually deploy it, how good will it be then? Right. How many horror stories do you have about there was an example I saw with stents a few years ago, that there was a stent that had been developed and there were very mixed results in phase 4 reporting. And you go back and look at it, and some physicians were putting it in one way and some physicians were putting it in another. And it was just a difference in how the surgeons had been trained. And so they had to go back and monitor and realize that something was going on. The same concept happens with patients on drugs. They may not realize the importance of the instructions that they're given. Anyway.
And I'll disclose that I'm one of them, because I'm on a sartan. I eat a tremendous amount of salt, except those 2 days before I go to my clinician. So
everybody does. Yeah. Everyone does. Yeah. It's like, I'm going to eat 3 eggs a day for breakfast, but the day that I go get my cholesterol taken, I'm not going to have any, because that would be bad.
So you brush your teeth extra before you see the dentist.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. You can't fool the models and the wearable stuff. And if you look at the way, we all have this thing about privacy now, and it's good. And we all want to protect our identity, and we're worried about our online identity and our banking and our finance and all that. But it seems that we're all really okay with our physiologic data being shared, right? It's okay. Nobody can necessarily monetize that as long as it's not going back to the insurance company, right? Sure. So there are immense wells of physiological data out there. Go look at the terms and agreements for your wearables. See who owns your data.
Yep.
And I bet you probably won't be surprised. But it's something that they can work with.
Sure.
There are huge amounts of resources back there. And if a company is not trying to develop a way of coming up with physiological predictors with that data, then they're really missing an economic train.
Absolutely.
So earlier you mentioned something about machine learning. And so I want to make really clear a difference in the philosophy of this physiological modeling and the machine learning that we see.
Please.
Because this is a point that comes up really over and over and over again. So if you're doing machine learning, we use a lot of machine learning for predictions and for coming up with calibration populations and for doing testing and mechanism analysis and all of that of machine learning. But you have individuals that are trying to use machine learning for diagnosis. That we're going to predict heart failure, and you'll get some that have fair prediction and fair generalization, that sort of thing. The difference in what we're doing is that, generally speaking, in those machine learning problems, they're coming at the data completely naively, right? The data is just data. The data is going to tell a story because the story is in the data, so it's tautological, right? Just having this data, the story has to be there because something has to be predicting that we're going to have this disease, and sometimes you get a reasonable prediction of that. We come at it from a different perspective. You can think of the model as a collection of priors, right? But instead of doing this Bayesian thing where you have, hey, X is going to be distributed this way based off of Y, instead we say, hey, look, there's a relationship between X and Y, and we can quantify that in some way. Okay, so you have an immense number of priors back there, and they're all linked. Does that make sense? It's not just that you have X depending on Y and Y depending on Z. You have X depending on Y, which depends on Z. And it's fundamentally a different construction. What that means from our perspective is that instead of just predicting that somebody is going to have heart failure or that somebody is at risk for a disease, we can instead say, this is the mechanism and this is where it's going to show up. And if it shows up, this is the treatment that you ought to give them, right? Which is, again, fundamentally different. Machine learning is limited to what it can see and the questions that you ask. And here, the nature of these models is that they are vast, so that, because they have to be in order to account for all the integrative dynamics, the dynamical system aspect, the redundancies and all of that. In order to make them be, to carry all those redundancies, they become very vast, which means that if you have an issue in one part of the model that will lead somebody to have a problem, you can identify that part, and then you can look at targeting that part, right? If you look at hypertension, and again, hypertension is just one of the things we consider here. Our hypertension rate in Mississippi is greater than 40%. It's a big drain on our indigent population resources. It is not a single factorial disease. There's no one cause for hypertension. There are dozens of known causes for hypertension. So just giving somebody medicine doesn't necessarily solve their hypertension. And in fact, if you look at any of the antihypertensive drugs, they have a 50% non-response rate. All of them do. Every single one for any population, 45 to 55%. So if you've got people it's difficult to get them to the doctor anyway, and they don't necessarily trust the doctor, right? We're looking at old folks, we're looking at rural folks. They don't trust the doctor. Sometimes there's this sociologic factor there. And you could bring them in and put them on a drug, and the drug doesn't work. I'm not going to go back to see that doctor. That doctor doesn't know anything, right? So the better we can treat them quicker, the more likely we are to keep them on the hook and actually get them the treatment that they need, as opposed to the current philosophy, which is, hey, we're just going to try this drug, and then we'll try this drug, and then we'll try this drug, and then we'll try this drug, and we'll try a combination, right? Which, as long as you're motivated, you will get to a good solution, but it may take a little while,
right?
And you may lose some in the process.
Absolutely.
So that difference, that's one of the reasons that we pursue this with this type of model, as opposed to doing pure machine learning on it. We'll do machine learning on the model. We'll use machine learning to augment the model. But in terms of, there's no aspect of the model itself that is quote unquote machine learning. Every bit of it is mechanistic, based off of hypotheses that have been espoused in the literature, and parameterized in the literature.
I appreciate you making that explain that difference, because I think
it's one of the harder pieces to get.
Yeah.
Another piece you had said earlier was talking about basins of attraction.
Yeah.
And here, this is another one of those kind of interesting things that we get to see in the model that you don't necessarily get to see in a lot of other, prediction modalities. So you sit in a basin of attraction right now, right? If I put a telemetric blood pressure device on you right now, then you will be more or less periodic. If I take your blood pressure at 9 o'clock in the morning tomorrow and 9 o'clock in the morning the next day, it will probably be very close to the same. It may not be close to what it is at noon, but tomorrow's noon measurement and the day after that's noon measurement will be close, right? We're on a cycle. And we have the circadian cycle, and people make a lot of it, and it's a big deal.
It is.
But that cycle that we're not in steady state, right? We're cycling through all of these pieces in the whole machinery. It's moving through space in some along some path. Well, you can think of this as being, there's a whole bunch of springs that are attached to a particle, and it got kicked into shape, and it's all moving around and will continue moving around. And if you change one of those springs, then you can wind up in a different pattern. You may wind up in the same pattern, but you may wind up in a different pattern, right? We know that there are multiple drugs that you can give somebody once that can cause a permanent shift in their balance. So the one I'm thinking of, if you dose an animal with angiotensin, which is a salt retentive hormone, in a large amount once, it will change their blood pressure permanently. Okay. So, that's a non-physiologic dose. It's a huge dose, but you will tighten one of those springs enough. They will not go back to where they were before. Right. And if you've tried to diet, I wouldn't be surprised if dieting isn't on that same kind of circadian rhythm, that weight isn't on that same circadian rhythm. Think about how hard it is to take off weight, that once you get into a new path, it's really hard to kick back down to an older one. That kind of behavior is much more easy to understand, to predict, and to look for ways out of in this kind of model than it is in a predictive model, or by looking at single factors one by one. And what I mean by that is, you can think of a disease state as being a particular path through feature space, through all of the variables that make us who we are. If you take a medicine and want to deflect that into a new into a non-sick pathology, or a normal pathology or state, then you've got to move that whole cycle. You can't just move the one piece. So the one piece has enough leverage to move that entire cycle around. And the models give us at least an idea whether you can do that or not. These are all of our selling points for models. These are all the things that we like about them.
I spent a lot of time in the pharmaceutical industry, but I'm far from the reductionist, and the whole concept of math, as you were talking about the beauty of math early on, sort of being above, whether we're talking about biologic or biophysical or biomechanical, whatever, but you have this math that swirls around it, and I think it's just very enlightening to hear someone like you with the mathematics background talk about this from sort of this higher level, and it's really very inspiring, and it's just I take my hat off to you.
Oh, well, thank you. There's once we think about this, the knock on biology from mathematicians is, in math, if you do the same thing twice, you better get the same thing out each time, right? Otherwise, it's not math. Otherwise, we call it biology, and biology's a mess. And we don't, this is a reason you don't see many mathematicians go to biology, right? You see mathematicians that do physics. You see mathematicians that do chemistry, kind of sometimes. You see mathematicians that do economics. They don't do biology because it's way too messy. It's nasty. It's atrociously hard. And it's not because of the math. It's because of the fact that we're looking at these dynamical systems. But again, just the realization that we have a model system, a model dynamical system, which is robust under almost every parameter shift that you can do up to 10%, was really an eye-opening concept for us, that the body is really that robust. I can't think of another system that this is true for, right? All the model systems I ever studied in graduate school were, you tweak something 10% and you had one attractor, now you've got 14 attractors, and they're going to be arranged on a circle on a partition unity and blah, blah, blah. It's amazing what the body is capable of doing. And you really can explain it just like in a chaos class with very simple equations, very simple math, but just small bits of variability between them. But the fact that it constrains into an envelope so nicely is, it's pretty amazing.
Well, I really, I want to obviously thank you for what you do, because it's important to have minds that are, as we say on this show, sort of creating the future and guiding us in this direction. Getting back to you though, we typically have this wrap-up question on the show. Obviously, early on, you mentioned some of the people in your career early on that guided you, between the fields of math and physiology. That was wonderfully talking about them. We have this sort of wrap-up question about the person that Dr. William Pruett never met, who he would have liked to have met. And it could be a mathematician, scientist, artist, philosopher, whatever. But if you had the ability to go in my hypothetical time machine over here and journey and meet somebody that you would have liked to have met and talk to for a little while, for Dr. William Pruett, who would that have been? And what would you like to speak to that person about? I'll let you think about it.
Really good question. There are a lot of people I really wish I could sit down with.
You can have a little party too. You don't have to meet.
There are so many, because there are so many people. Because I straddle two different disciplines, then there are so many people that I've had to build on. There are just a lot of folks I would really like to be able to sit down with. Henri Poincaré is high on my list just because of the way that he was able to see dynamical systems. And although he didn't necessarily formalize everything to a quote unquote modern level, his level of insight into how to estimate what was going to happen in a dynamical system and appreciate the complexity, but be able to look at it as a reduction was, in many ways, he's the prototypical modeler. Because of that. Arthur Guyton, who died a few years before I joined our department, if you go back and read his papers, especially the papers from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, they are perfectly written gems. They have, I call it a golden thread that runs through them from the first word to the last word, where every little piece is in place, that he can tell a perfect story about how all of these different forces are coming together to give you a certain kind of results. And he doesn't reduce anything down to simple. He had a beautiful way of laying everything out in a line and providing you a fantastic perspective on which to look at the world. And I've only gotten to know him through his papers. I know many that were friends with him. Dr. Hester, who I worked with him for years. 30 years, I think. But I never had the opportunity to meet him. And those papers are, even if you're not a biologist, go back and read his papers on cardiac output and venous return from the late 60s. And they are 3-page papers that are just delightful to read. They're just beautifully constructed things. Those are probably the two that I would really like to just sit down with, and really for the same reason, that they give you that golden path to follow to understand really complex things using what you already know, as opposed to having to throw $50 words at you and lists of definitions that are 100 lines long. It's just, here's an idea, here's how to talk about it, here's how to think about it, and here are 1,000 versions of that idea. So both brilliant people.
Excellent. Well, once again, I really, obviously you're extremely busy. I really want to thank you again for the time that you take to come on the show, talk to us about what you're doing, talk to us about the future, because it's really fabulous work. And for everybody, once again, that's watching or going to be listening on the various radio networks, we've been spending time with Dr. William Pruett from the Physiology and Biophysics Department, University of Mississippi Medical Center, doing truly amazing things with the human model, with the virtual clinical trial model, and really creating, as we say, the future for health and wellness moving forward. Dr. Pruett, thank you for everything you do, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Ira.